Welcome to Question Time. On tonight's panel, Douglas Ross, an MP since 2017. He left the government in protest over the actions of the Prime Minister's advisor Dominic Cummings and was elected unopposed as leader of the Scottish Conservative Party less than 3 months ago. Joining us down the line from London, Seema Malhotra, a former management consultant, advisor to Harriet Harman and Shadow Treasury Minister under Jeremy Corbyn, now Labour's Shadow Employment Minister. Kate Forbes, an MSP for 4 years. She's the first woman to have presented the budget in the Scottish Parliament and then to become the government's first female finance secretary. Also joining the debate via video link, Professor Mark Walport, a member of SAGE, the Government Scientific Advisory Group, an immunologist, former director of the Wellcome Trust and former chief scientific advisor to the government. Miriam Brett, commentator and economic advisor, former senior advisor to the SNP and a candidate for the party in the 2017 election. And one of the wealthiest people in Scotland, a man who made his fortune in the oil industry, now known for his philanthropic work, Ian Wood. Good evening. Welcome to my guests here in the studio and to Seema and Mark, who are joining us down the line, and of course to our audience again who are joining us via video link. Very good to have you with us. Tonight you are all from Edinburgh, the Edinburgh area. Thank you for joining us. And of course to you at home watching, if you want to join in as well, you know how to do it, on social media at BBC Question Time. Join in the conversation and the debate. It would be lovely to hear what you've got to say. So let's hear our first question tonight, which is from Diane Craig.
Thank you, Fiona. Do you think that this pandemic has been managed better by Nicola Sturgeon in Scotland than it has by Boris Johnson in England?
Kate?
Well, I certainly don't think it's a competition because every government is responsible with the trust of the people to manage this pandemic in a way that sees the virus suppressed and also trying to manage the other harms, whether those are economic, social or other health harms. We've seen from some of the polling, certainly even this week, that I think about 3/4 of people in Scotland are satisfied with the way that Nicola Sturgeon has handled the pandemic.
And do you think she's handling it better than Boris Johnson? That's the question.
I think she's handled it in a remarkable way. I think it's one of the most challenging situations for any leader to be in. And, you know, at the very beginning, she said, we're going to make mistakes. And she's been upfront right throughout with integrity and honesty that things have been challenging.
I mean, Scotland has a higher growth infection growth rate than England and the UK as a whole.
But we also have the lowest rates per 100,000 anywhere in the UK, and that's the figures that matter. We know that because we suppressed it so low during the summer, and schools went back earlier, universities went back earlier, that we're seeing the figures increase, which is why early action is key to avoid a complete lockdown. And I think that Nicola Sturgeon has done that. Certainly this week's figures in terms of dissatisfaction with the Prime Minister in Scotland is very high. It's almost the inverse. 76% are dissatisfied with the way that the Prime Minister has handled it. But from my perspective, the challenge for every government, not just in the UK, but across the world, is to suppress the virus, to keep the trust of the people and to ensure that we manage these other harms in terms of the economy or society more widely.
Well, Diane's question is very pointed. Who's managing it better, Nicola Sturgeon or Boris Johnson? Douglas Ross.
I don't think anyone can treat this as a competition.
But that is the question.
When people continue to lose their lives, when people continue to be infected at an alarming rate. But I think we do have to look across the UK. There has been a very similar approach taken by all 4 governments. And indeed around the world, we're still learning about this virus. A virus that didn't even exist this time last year. But there have been mistakes and big mistakes in Scotland. And we've got to accept that and listen to the advice that we're hearing when these mistakes are made and learn from them. Because in Scotland, we had people testing positive for COVID-19 in a hospital being discharged into a care home. We can't allow that to happen. We've got to learn from that. And Nicola Sturgeon told us we would hear about this and there'd be a report in September. We're still waiting in October for that. We have the highest percentage of deaths in the care home setting anywhere in the UK here in Scotland. So no one can claim a success. It is a battle that we are all still fighting. It is one that continues to take lives. It is one we're still trying to get on top of. And that's just the health battle. We've also got the economic response to deal with as well.
And are you satisfied with the way Boris Johnson is handling the pandemic?
There have been mistakes by the UK government, by the Scottish government, by governments around the world. There have been errors made, and at some time...
So what do you think the UK government has done wrong?
At some time, we will look back and say, this should have been done differently, that should have been done differently. But I don't think anyone objectively can look at what has happened in Scotland and say what has been the big difference. What have the Scottish Government done differently from the rest of the UK? There are areas where I think the Scottish Government have to learn, for example, testing positive people for COVID-19 in a hospital and putting them into a care home. That was the worst thing that could have happened.
Hamza, in our audience, you've got your hand up.
Hi. So with regards to mistakes and Nicola Sturgeon, what is the concrete evidence that the First Minister has used in justifying her decision to crush the hospitality sector and saying that the recent spikes in cases have come directly from pubs, bars and restaurants?
OK, I will let you come back in on that. I'm just going to deal with the main question here from Diane, which is, has this pandemic been managed better by Nicola Sturgeon in Scotland than it has by Boris Johnson in England? And neither of you say, either want to say, and you're both at pains to point out it's not a competition, because it does matter to people who has handled it well, because lives are at stake. Mark, do you feel that either government is listening to you, to the advice you're giving at Sage?
Yes, I've got no doubt they are listening to the advice, the scientific advice they're getting. But frankly, I think it's the wrong question that's being asked, because it's not internal comparisons. It's actually looking at other countries that are doing well, so South Korea, Vietnam, Germany. I think what we have to do is learn from what's working well in other countries. And frankly, I think it would be easier if there was a bit more commonality in the approach across all of the nations of the UK.
And also, we saw the advice that was released by Sage this week, advice that was given to the government on the 21st of September. From what we can see, neither the Scottish Government nor the UK Government are following much of the advice that Sage was giving.
Well, they're following some of it, but the bottom line, of course, is that Sage is looking purely through the lens of controlling the pandemic. And they're also having to balance the very difficult tightrope of the miserable health consequences for other people as well, which is the effects of the economic damage, the unemployment, the damage to education. But I think what we have to do is we need a really clear strategy, and I think that's been less visible. What we've got to do, frankly, is learn to live with the virus whilst working on therapeutics and vaccines. And we've got to get it under control, but keeping it under control with much better public health logistic delivery.
Lucas, you've got your hand up.
Yeah, so none of the panellists have actually been able to answer really who has performed better, Nicola Sturgeon or Boris Johnson. And of course, it's a horrendously difficult period for both of them. But why, and can they explain the disparity between public opinion and how they've handled it? Clearly, people believe that Nicola Sturgeon has performed so much better.
And Grant, you've got your hand up.
Yeah, I just wanted to follow on from what Douglas was saying and exactly what Lucas was saying. If both Holyrood and Westminster have both made mistakes, is there a lesson to be learned for the UK government in the way that the public are perceiving Holyrood and Nicola Sturgeon so favourably?
Seema Malhotra, who do you think's performed better out of the two?
I think we are in a decisive moment in our efforts to tackle the coronavirus, and the numbers are clearly moving in the wrong direction, and that's across Scotland as well as England. And my worry is that neither governments are learning from the mistakes that were made very early on. The UK government, it seems to me, has lost control of the virus. They're losing confidence, and they're no longer following scientific advice. We've also not seen Nicola Sturgeon come forward to follow the scientific advice that came through in the way that it did from Sage. And under the SNP government, you've already mentioned that we've got the highest R rate in the UK. Both governments were far too slow in setting up test, track and isolate or test and protect. And my worry is that with those businesses and livelihoods at stake now, if we don't have a way in which both governments are going to learn from what's gone wrong and be honest and open about it and work together more closely, we're going to see us go into a winter where it's going to be much more difficult for all of us. That is why Labour has called this week, as you know, for a 2 to 3 week circuit break in line with Sage advice.
And what does that mean, Seema? Seema, sorry to interrupt. What does that mean, a circuit break? How would you define that? It is in what Sage has also, Sage has said that it'd be more along the lines of where we were in May with people staying at home, but there can be variations on that because we are further forward. And what's been very clear from Keir Starmer is that, and from the Labour Party, is that we need to keep schools open. And I think that is fairly universally felt, that we should do what we can to keep schools open. But if we are to have a circuit break, and that means to set back the virus by
You know, maybe 28 days is estimated. The estimate also being that we could save 8,000 lives because we get it under control prior to Christmas and we protect the NHS in doing that. Surely that's got to be advice that we listen to, because if we delay, as the government has repeatedly, then the consequences will be far greater, both in terms of impact on jobs and livelihoods, but also on the nation's health and the number of deaths.
And do you support what the Mayor of Greater Manchester, Andy Burnham, is saying, a Labour man, obviously, in terms of he doesn't want to see a further lockdown in his area, despite what you're saying?
Well, I've been in touch with Andy, and I think one of the critical things has been that it hasn't felt that the evidence on which those decisions are being made and the way in which local leaders are involved has been anywhere near what we need to see. And I just don't understand why we have both the UK government that has over many years seen cuts to local government, that has made local government less resilient. Also, the Scottish government has cut funding to local government in Scotland by much more than has been cut from in terms of budgets from Westminster. You know, this lack of resilience has made it increasingly difficult. But what we've seen is that local authorities, when they have been able to go about track and trace, have actually been doing far better than the Serco and others on whom the government is spending 12 billion. So there's a real question of confidence and engagement with local leaders, and also the key thing that financial support has to go hand in hand with those restrictions. And the government has not had the trust of local authorities and local leaders that is happening.
Ian, there's a great reluctance to answer the question, which Diane has put, so I think we must try and do it justice, which is, do you think this pandemic has been managed better by Nicola Sturgeon in Scotland than it has by Boris Johnson in England? So far, none of the politicians want to answer that question.
OK. I honestly think it's the wrong question.
But it is the question, that is the thing.
Well, OK. Right now, we're faced with probably the biggest health crisis the world has ever had. And that's applying across the world. All countries are facing a myriad of problems. I think in Scotland's case, our biggest tragedy was the care homes. I think on generally, I think we undoubtedly, on the first wave, restarted too quickly. We tried to get going too quickly, and we've now got a huge second wave. I think, frankly, with the students coming back in the way they did, I hate to say this, but I think that was a bad decision. I think that's undoubtedly added.
Well, do you think the university should have stayed closed?
The real question, well, not closed, but done it all online. Perfectly feasible. The real question is, what do we do now? How do we keep working at this problem and get past the second wave more successfully than the first wave? That's what we should be concentrating on. We spend far too much time in Scotland and the UK arguing who's right and who's wrong. We're now at a stage, frankly, where we've got to make some clear decisions and try and get this next stage right.
Mark, you wanted to come back in.
Yes, I mean, what we have to do is absolutely get on top of this infection, and that involves tight social restrictions of movement. And only then will public health measures work effectively, but we've got to get them working. And as I say, the real opportunity is to actually learn from what's been done abroad, rather than having, I think, rather fruitless internal competitions about whether Scotland or England is doing better. They could both do better.
Susan Young.
Yeah, just picking up on a point that Douglas Ross made there, in that he doesn't feel that different parts of the UK have done anything particularly different in handling the pandemic. And yet that doesn't equate to the very, very clear public opinion polls as to who indeed has handled it better between Nicola Sturgeon and Boris Johnson. So surely this absolutely comes down to communication from the two governments, whereas obviously we have very clear communication daily from Nicola Sturgeon and yet not from Boris Johnson. Is that, do you think, Douglas, what the difference in opinion polls is?
Miriam.
Yeah. I think you've hit the nail on the head there. I think one of the clearest kind of distinctions between the two divergent approaches, and I think it's important to recognise here that actually we had a Four Nations approach beforehand, which veered off path when Boris Johnson decided to, in my opinion, kind of preemptively ease lockdown, and have since seen a Four Nations approach. I think on your point on messaging, that's key. When polled, 80% of people in Scotland said that the Scottish Government has good communications. 72% of people in Scotland says that the UK Government has bad communication strategy just now. So I think that gets to really kind of one of the key distinctions there. More broadly though, and Seema touched upon that a moment ago, I think one of the key issues that we need to address in terms of our handling of this crisis more broadly is the scale of outsourcing that we have seen throughout this entire pandemic. We are seeing consultants being brought in for a week who are being paid a year's worth of nurses' salaries. We are seeing Deloitte, Serco, McKinsey being brought in, consultancy firms who are looking to maximise profit and who do not have expertise in public health, are being brought in to oversee how we respond to test, track and trace. Now that for me is an abject failure. Why should the taxes of key workers who are trying so hard just now to help alleviate this crisis line the pockets of corporations who are not experts in public health? So for me, what we need to do, if it is the case that we are recommended to have a circuit break, if it is the case that we are recommended to have another lockdown, we need to take a moment, step back, reassess our current approach and recognise that public health should be in public hands and use that as the mantra going forward to guide us.
So Douglas Ross, what did you think when that we saw today about private consultants getting up to £7,000 a day in terms of helping the government? Do you think that's right? Is that where the money should be going?
Well, I think we've also got to remember during this pandemic, the private sector have been involved in terms of generating the ventilation capacity. Because right at the start, our biggest concern in Scotland and across the UK was we wouldn't have that
But what about the point that Miriam's making?
Figures. So I think we've got to remember the private sector have worked with the public sector to ensure that there was
but in terms of the point that
capability.
Miriam's making, and there's consultants getting £7,000 a day.
Well, you know, I'm not going to defend levels like that, but we can't just say the whole of the private sector was wrong to get involved.
I mean, obviously your government's paying for it.
In trying to help us get on top of this
we're
pandemic.
paying for it, you know.
But
yeah, I say the taxpayers paying for it.
Susan, Lucas and Grant have all made the point, and I don't think anyone on this panel, from respective parties and quite opposing party political views, has been able to say anything that the Scottish Government have done differently from the UK Government. It has been a UK-wide approach.
Well,
it is one that has largely been the same right across the country.
But different measures have been taken at different times.
But I do agree with Susan, it does come down to communications. Because Nicola Sturgeon, and I'm not...
It's not just communication.
Sorry, Kate, if I can just finish. Nicola Sturgeon is a very good communicator. She is on our television every day in Scotland doing the daily briefings. But when it comes down to the detail, we still have, as you said, Fiona, the highest R rate anywhere in the United Kingdom, the highest percentage of deaths in care homes anywhere in the United Kingdom, one of the highest death rates per head of population in Europe. So there are clear challenges that we've got to face. And as Sir Ian said, we've got to learn from the mistakes we've made, because we are 7 months into this pandemic now, and we're probably closer to where we were at March than we are at the end of this crisis. We've still got a lot to go through. We've still got a lot to learn from, and we cannot make the same mistakes in the next 7 months that have been made in the 7 months before. And that's why, Kate, your government has to explain what happened to these people.
The most important lesson to learn is moving quickly. So if we learned anything from the beginning of the pandemic back in March, is that the more decisively you act, the quicker you act, the faster you can suppress the virus and get it under control. Now, Seema talked about the need for a circuit breaker. Now, she may be aware that we are currently in the midst of increased lockdown restrictions. Some of them are localised, but we have national restrictions right across Scotland right now. And the idea is working quickly and decisively with this 2-week period to try and bring the numbers under control. And it's that acting quickly that matters.
But if as you say, Kate, because it is a puzzle, and I'm not necessarily sure you will have the answer, but if as you say, Nicola Sturgeon is acting quickly and her communication skills are good, why is the infection rate so high in Scotland? What's going wrong?
But you're choosing one infection rate. You're talking about the R number. What I'm talking about...
Well, it's pretty important.
It's important, but what we really look at the moment is the rates per 100,000. That's what matters. And in terms of across the UK, if you look at the figures rising, the Prime Minister announced his 3-tier approach. I'm not sure that will go far enough in terms of suppressing the virus in the way that we need to. We're in the midst of a 2-week increased lockdown right now. But the other difference, it's not just about communication, because this requires the public's consent and it requires political leaders to treat the public like adults, because ultimately we are dependent on the public following the rules and the regulations and understanding the evidence behind it. And that is the key to communication, and that's what I think distinguishes the First Minister from the Prime Minister.
There's quite a few hands up. Let's hear from some of them. Toby.
Hi, thank you, Fiona. I feel like as a young person, it's very easy for me to answer this question. I mean, Nicola Sturgeon wasn't the one. We had one of these chief advisories, the lockdown rules and then not even be like effectively criticised. I mean, from that perspective, I feel like it just sums up Boris Johnson's like whole approach to like the whole pandemic.
Kate Malcolmus?
Hi, yes. Douglas says that nobody can point to any difference. I think he's missing the point that this is about leadership. It's not about numbers. That looking simply at the numbers disregards the fact that if you don't have the people with you, regardless of how hard you lock down, you're not going to get people to comply. You're going to get people to actually start to believe all kinds of conspiracy theories, and you're going to end up with non-compliance. So this is about a difference in leadership, hearts and minds. It isn't about a difference in R rates.
Diane, you asked the question. What do you think about what you've heard?
Yeah, certainly I don't think it was a competition, and that wasn't why I asked the question. But I do feel that Nicola Sturgeon has communicated very well. She hasn't shied away from questions from the press and TV presenters, as Boris and his ministers have done. And I think she's made clear-cut decisions that she has explained well, and she's earned the respect from the people. And, you know, she needs the people on board to follow what she wants them to do. And that's precisely what she's doing, rather than hiding away like Boris is doing.
Well, I'm going to move on, if I may, just because you've had a good go, Douglas. I know there'll be other things for you to say.
Just on the quick action of the Scottish Government, if I can, just
very
quickly,
briefly.
It's really important there's quick action, but also quick action for the businesses that are affected. And Kate is Finance Secretary here in Scotland, and they are waiting 10 days now to get information
a far more generous
on
package
how,
of support than
on
the
how
UK
they can get support.
providing.
So they were told to close at 51 hours notice, and they had to wait 10 days to find out they're getting £40 million. We don't know how that's going to be delivered, and that pales into
and we've got the end of the furlough scheme
£700 million
jobs in a few weeks'
that
time.
the Chancellor's making available. Please, Kate, just use your speed and your urgency to get that money out to businesses, please.
We are going to come on to the business case. Let me just, before we do, because I want to get another question in, I want to mention that next week, we are looking for people to join our virtual audience in Sedgefield, and the week after that in Lincoln. So if you live in the area, do please get in touch. Go to the Question Time website and you can fill in the form there. Do get involved. We'd love to hear from you. Be part of our virtual audience. Right, let's come to our next question, which is from Martin Dundas.
Thanks, Fiona. When is a cafe a restaurant and a restaurant a bar? And does it differ in Edinburgh, Cardiff, Belfast or London?
Well, thank you for that, Martin. I've been looking into the regulations. So let's take cafe, for example. So you can sit down and eat in a cafe in Edinburgh, but only between 6 a.m. and 6 p.m. They close at 10 p.m. in London and in Cardiff, and they're shut altogether in Belfast. Mark, do you want to kick us off with this?
Yes, sure. I mean, the first thing to say is that this virus transmits in indoor spaces more easily than it does in the outside. And the second thing is that, going back to the last question, the reason the numbers aren't going down is because we're, on average, making too many social contacts. And so that we know that lockdown works because when this pandemic started, with tight restrictions, it did come under control. Restaurants, cafes, it depends actually how people are seated. It depends how people behave. It depends whether they're inside or outside. And I think that when you read through, and I read through before coming all the different restrictions. I looked at Northern Ireland, I looked at Scotland, I looked at Wales, I looked at England. It is very confusing and it is different. The bottom line is that we need to reduce our social contacts. And until we get it down similar to the levels that we started with, this is not going to come under control. And frankly, we do need to get on top of the second wave, and urgency does matter. And so we've just got to get on with it. And I don't think it's helpful having lots of different hard to understand rules.
So as a scientist, just help us understand, does it make sense then, scientifically, that the rules are different in these different areas?
Well, I mean, the first thing to say is that there is not a perfect science that says you can't, there isn't a science that says what a restaurant is or a cafe, and nor is there a specific science that says 6 people or 5 people or 7 people. What has to happen is that our social distancing has got to be maintained. And of course, we're all in this together. I mean, everyone has a responsibility here, but the rules have got to be clear. And I think the argument for a circuit breaker is that it is tough, but it is relatively short. And as we had heard earlier, if we can, by a month's time, if we can get the numbers down, then we've got to get testing and tracing on top of it rather than chasing behind. At the moment, although the numbers available of tests has gone up dramatically, it's still chasing demand. And we're only going to decrease the demand if we actually get on top of it. And then we can really focus on outbreak control, on testing in environments where the risk is higher, on testing in the health system. That's what we have to do.
And so your advice would be to shut them all together for a brief period, or for a period of whatever length?
For a brief period of time, we've really got to get this under control. There's no question about that.
Jim.
Thanks, Fiona. Can the panel please explain to me, following on from Martin's question, how the government is going to expect employers in the hospitality sector, like pubs and wine bars, to be able to pay their employees wages of 20% when their businesses are closed and there's actually no money coming in? It just doesn't add up.
Graham, you had your hand up.
Yeah, thank you, Fiona. Again, I think is it the level of differences across the 4 nations that's adding to the confusion? Is it the case that actually it's a rule for some, but not for me, because I'll just pretend I'm in Cardiff for the purposes of this meeting that I'm having, or the lunch that I'm having as well? I think it's just too difficult for people to interpret the rules. It's too easy for them to interpret it for themselves. So I think looking at the sage advice and making the local lockdown nationwide has to be the way forward.
Colin?
Thanks, Fiona. I think there's a point being missed by a lot of the panel that Mark only just mentioned at the end of his point, that the lockdowns is supposed to be time to break the chain of infection and give time to bring up the testing and tracing system to a suitable level so that that takes over and brings down the levels. And why are we not hearing enough about that?
Okay. Miriam, I mean, this is a sort of 2-part question from Martin, and also our audience has thrown in then 10 penneth as well. When is a cafe, a restaurant, or bar? Because also that affects whether they can open or not. And also the fact that it is different in the 4 nations. Do you think it should be one message, as we've heard there?
I mean, just now, I think, well, firstly, there obviously has been confusion about what constitutes as a cafe and a bar, and we've seen that replicated elsewhere in the UK as well.
I mean, we were hearing Robert Jenrick in the UK government cabinet saying that because if you're going to eat food in a restaurant or in a cafe in the UK, in certain parts of the UK now, or in the pub rather, that they have to serve a substantial meal, which he was asked, could it be a pasty? So it could be a pasty if it had a side salad, or if it had chips. I mean, if we're dealing with that level of complexity, it's very hard to navigate.
Yeah, and I understand that. In terms of whether we would have nationwide in the sense of a UK-wide lockdown, the practicalities of that, I think, would be very difficult now for all 4 nations because we've all gone in different directions. I think what we need to do just now is listen to the public health advice and follow whatever it is that we're asked to do there. I think that's first and foremost an issue. I think on the point on hospitality, there's a point that's being overlooked here as well, which is that hospitality, and I say this as somebody who worked in the industry for a long time, is an area that is very, very insecure at the best of times for workers. And it is, we have seen kind of a lot of zero-hour contracts, a lot of precarious employment in the hospitality sector already. And actually with this pandemic, as with so much of it, what it is served to do is not only create new vulnerabilities, but expose fractures in our economy that already existed. The furlough scheme was mentioned there, and I want to touch upon that. What we have in replacement for the furlough scheme is much better than the cliff edge that they were looking to do. It is still deeply inadequate. It only covers areas, parts of it only covers areas that are in lockdown, and we're still asking people in many circumstances to make a significant cut to their wages. Now, are they getting cuts off their rent? Are they getting cuts off their bills? Are they getting cuts off their food? No. What I would like to see is a rollout of the initial furlough initiative that covers not only areas in lockdown, but also other areas, so that we can cover areas like the performing arts and the creative sector that actually are going to remain relatively closed for the foreseeable future. On the point, and this is my last point on hospitality here, when we emerge out of this crisis, we need to see a new deal for workers, because this has exposed vulnerabilities that existed for far too long in our economy. We need to ban zero-hour contracts, we need to root out precarious work, and we need a real living wage for all workers throughout the UK.
So, Doug, sorry, okay, I was just going to come to Douglas, but do you want to jump in, Ian? Sorry.
Yeah. I'm going to begin with the same point again. There's a huge, big challenge and problem out there. And frankly, we're talking about not unimportant issues, but not primary issues. I mean, I think there's a breakthrough appeared with the three-tier approach. I mean, clearly the country's being affected in different ways. And it's absolutely right that some parts of the country should be subject to different rules and regulations than others. So the three-tier approach is a good approach and definitely should be pursued with great care taken as to what the lockdown issues are and how they might be applied. In terms of hospitality, I've got 3 sons, 2 of which are very heavily involved in pubs and restaurants and bars, so I've clearly followed that quite carefully. One thing you must remember, there's a huge number of young people employed, and one of the biggest concerns I have is we're going to finish up with a lot of young people unemployed. So I really hope we can do something significant with hospitality and try and prevent what could be very significant unemployment in that area.
Douglas, I mean, hearing what Miriam's had to say, and in fact what Ian's had to say, in terms of young people's unemployment and the furlough falling off a cliff, do you think Boris Johnson should be doing more?
So it's not falling off a cliff, and I think that was actually Miriam's point. You know, what we have now is, first of all, the furlough scheme.
Well, it's significantly reduced in terms of the money people are going to get.
But when it was introduced, it has protected 9.6 million jobs across the United Kingdom. £40 billion of taxpayers' money has been invested protecting these jobs. £13.5 billion going to the self-employed with about 5 million claims. This has been a significant and one of the most generous schemes anywhere in the world.
But then you've got Greater Manchester, you've got the Americans in open revolt. I mean, surely this is not good for Boris Johnson, because clearly he wants to bring in some kind of extra restrictions there, and he's got a fight on his hands.
But now the replacement scheme is actually very similar. If you look at the levels of support that individuals and employers have to put in France, in Spain, in Germany, is very similar to the 2/3 that the government are paying in the United Kingdom compared to other countries. But Ian is absolutely right, because young people are effectively the ones that could potentially be the most affected by this. First of all, their education. So many of them didn't get to finish their school education. They didn't get to sit exams. They went on to college and university, and in Scotland and in other parts of the United Kingdom, they had a terrible initial experience at university, and now they are going to be paying for this for much of their lives. And the job market, when we get through this health pandemic, the global response to the economic emergency that we're all going to face is one that we have to treat extremely seriously. So I think it is really young people we've got to be thinking about, and that's why the UK government have introduced the Kickstart scheme and many other schemes to help young people into employment. But again, as the Chancellor has said and the Prime Minister has said, it's going to be impossible to save every single job, but we are putting in place the tools to hopefully protect as many of them as possible, as we've done with the furlough scheme and the replacement scheme going forward.
Seema Malhotra.
I was very surprised to hear that the job support scheme was talked about by Douglas there as being the same as the furlough scheme, or almost the same. Even Dame Louise Casey has come out today saying that if you're going to say that you're going to pay 2/3 of someone's salary, then you should also be saying that they'll only be able to afford 2/3 of their rent or pay for 2/3 of the food for their family. We've got a system that is currently, and decisions being made by the Prime Minister and the Chancellor, that are pushing people into destitution. And the most important thing we need to do right now is look at how we both deal with the health crisis that we're facing, as well as the economic crisis. The job support scheme, I've had many employers tell me that it is not going to incentivise them to keep on employees, especially as times get tough again, and many in the aviation industry as well who are suffering from the slowdown. And that's because when the government talked about this scheme as trying to keep people on part-time, actually it's more expensive to keep two people on part-time than it is to keep one person on full-time. And rather than this, the government should be looking at what's been done in Germany and elsewhere, and what the Labour Party has been saying, to have a proper short hours scheme that supports people to stay on work and in their jobs part-time, because the cost of long-term unemployment is much greater than what we're going to otherwise have to pay to keep people in their jobs, in viable jobs, that will be there when we come through this next period. And I just want to come back to this first question as well, when we were talking about how have we done Boris Johnson versus Nicola Sturgeon. Let's be clear, we've had some of the worst excess death rates in the world. Neither has done as well as they needed to for our country, and nor as other countries have done. And now we're headed for the worst financial recession, economic recession, certainly in Europe. And I think we have to ask questions about what's going wrong. And we have to ask those questions honestly. The government has to ask those questions honestly. And that's why it's important that they continue to work with the opposition, to listen to the opposition. We do need a four-nation approach, and we do need to take the job losses that are there now and could be coming, with 1 million facing a cliff edge at the end of October, much more seriously than the government's doing now.
Grant.
Thanks, Fiona. If we're looking for money, why don't we, here's a radical suggestion along the lines of Yanis Varoufakis last week, the billions of pounds that have been given to management consultants, instead of giving it to them, why don't we give it to local leaders like Andy Burnham for his local test and trace regime? Let's give it to hospitality workers, and let's give it to all the theatre and entertainment workers who so desperately need it and have been failed.
Yvonne.
Hi, like many people, I'm really surprised that when Rishi Sunak made this announcement back in March to put his arms around everybody and support us, that this would suddenly stop, which feels like it's about to happen. Because if we were at war, we'd have a war chest and it would be continuing. You wouldn't give up after 7 months or whatever. And I feel like the government is went into one gear and they've totally shifted into another one now. And it looks really bleak for a lot of people in lots of different sectors of the different economies, different areas and different parts of the country.
Hamza.
So to add to Seema's point about the job safety scheme, Rishi Sunak also said that universal credit is there as a safety net for those whose minimum wage income has dropped. But he's also proposed cuts to universal credit. So this is going to cost the 6 million households £1,000 a year, with the bottom fifth losing 7% of their disposable income. I think this is just terrible economics, because it's he's taken £6 billion out of the economy by cutting benefits, and that's over £6 billion less cash being spent in a consumer-driven economy. So these are reducing incomes for the households that actually have to spend the money. So as usual, the poor are paying the cost of it.
Kate, we've ranged quite far and wide in this particular debate. I'm just going to bring you back to the original question asked by Martin. When is a cafe a restaurant, or bar? And also, there's been a lot of talk about that here in Scotland in terms of what cafes can operate, given that restaurants are shut, often for takeaway. Does it differ in Edinburgh, Cardiff, Belfast or London? Do you think there should be one rule across the United Kingdom?
So no, for two reasons, but I also think that we want to take a four nations approach as much as possible. So clarity of messaging is critically important when dealing with this virus. However, the simpler the message, often the harsher it is. So if you look at Scotland, for example, I represent the Highlands, which has a different rate of infection than some parts of the Central Belt. Now, we've taken action to have stricter restrictions in some parts of the Central Belt than we do in the Highlands, because it does lead to greater compliance so people can understand what's going on, and there's clearly higher rates there. Now, that will mean a slight variation in what those restrictions are. The second point, though, as to why we need different restrictions is because we're managing multiple harms. Now, I don't have, in the Scottish Government, the fiscal levers. I've asked for them multiple times. I don't have the fiscal levers or the financial resources, because we're not allowed to borrow, to properly compensate employers. Now, we're coming, as you said, to what is a cliff edge, because there's no way around it. The job support scheme is not a replacement for the furlough scheme. It disincentivises employers. We know from our own analysis that it's going to cost tens of thousands of Scottish jobs, which will be exacerbated right across the United Kingdom. And ultimately, employers need support. As Jim said earlier, hospitality has been through the most challenging of times. Businesses up and down the country have made enormous sacrifices, have invested. But right now, with less resources and the prospect of a cliff edge with furlough coming to an end, they're having to make very difficult choices. And for me, the message to the UK government is that if there's going to be these restrictions, as we manage the health harms as well as the COVID harms, and with our primary objective right now of suppressing the virus, because actually suppressing the virus is the fastest way of getting back to some form of normality economically or socially. If we can suppress the virus, then we can restart. But when it comes to financial support, Douglas mentioned a short while ago about business support in this break period that we've got, 2-week period. One of the challenges was waiting for the Chancellor to make an announcement last Friday on what they were going to do in terms of additional financial support.
That's not
and
fair,
because it's
Kate.
one of our primary sources for the Scottish Government, it's our primary source of funding, that is the primary means by which we have to compensate and mitigate the effects. Now, we largely work together quite cooperatively, but I think it's ludicrous that just as we're seeing the rate of infection increase and the likelihood of restrictions, greater restrictions, we're seeing the end of what has been a lifeline. And I accept, I've been open and honest that it has been a lifeline for many businesses. Now is not the time to end it. Everybody can see it. Every business the length and breadth of the country can see it. But the Chancellor can't appear to see it, no matter how many times it's put to him.
But Kate, in fairness, you and the Labour Party welcomed when the Chancellor announced the replacement furlough. You both welcomed it at the time, and you said it was right that there was a replacement, there was no cliff edge. But to say you were waiting for the Chancellor to outline any further support you could give, the Chancellor has now said Scotland will get £700 million
on Friday,
more.
And I was thankful for it.
So why then today did Nicola Sturgeon announce it would still just be £40 million going to the businesses that are affected? £40 million that won't be available until
you
next...
You do appreciate that's for health.
Sorry, Kate.
It's for health,
no,
and it's not just for business support.
Kate, it's not.
It's not just for business support.
It's for the £3,000 grants that the UK government are giving to businesses in England that you could give to businesses in Scotland. They are waiting right now. They've had to wait 10 days.
Well, 2 points.
Sorry, Kate, if I can just finish, because this is really important to the businesses that are watching this, because I spoke to them on Monday. I had a virtual summit with businesses, and they are crying out for help, and they're crying out for help now. So give them that £700 million you've got from the Chancellor, or give them some of the...
That does not understand
Kate,
the £700 million.
Give
but
them
that's based on an absurd position.
Well, give them some of the £250 million that you haven't spent.
I know, but that's based on inaccuracy.
Or the Digital Connectivity Fund. Why not spend that?
Hang on, if you both talk at the same time, no one can hear. Let's let Kate answer. Let Kate answer. You've made your point. Let's let Kate answer.
The 2 points I would make is, one, small grants of £1,500 is no replacement for the furlough scheme. That's point number one. Point number two is that £700 million, worth asking the Chancellor, that does not just cover business support. That's for health, that's for transport, and a whole host of other things, so just for clarity. The third point is that the business support we've put in place is more generous than the UK government support. It is. The facts are there. Now, at the moment in the rest of the UK, if you're obliged by law to close, you'll get a grant. But all the businesses in the supply chain won't get funding, and other businesses that are not directly impacted won't get funding. In Scotland, we've provided funding for the businesses required to close by law, but also the businesses in the supply chain and the businesses that might see reduced trading but aren't required to close by law. And I think that's the breadth of support that we need to see. But let's not kid ourselves. £1,500 of grant, as important as it is no replacement for the furlough scheme.
OK, I'm going to take another question now from Colin Campbell.
Thank you, Fiona. A recent poll shows that Scottish independence has a huge majority of 58% support. How long can the UK government continue to deny the Scottish people the right to have a say on their future?
Now, Douglas, you've said before that London is in part responsible for the support for independence in Scotland. Do you want to expand on that?
Well, just to answer the question, I don't downplay the challenge that we face. Those of us in Scotland, like me, who believe in the Union, who believe in Scotland's proud place as part of four nations of the United Kingdom. But I also don't believe there's anything inevitable about this, despite what the SNP representatives might say on this panel, because I think Scotland's best days and proudest days are when we stand together as part of a union that we help to build. But I also look at this, from a very personal point of view. I've got a wee 18-month-old son, Alistair. He's sound asleep in Murray right now, back home. And I look at him, and when I see these polls, I don't get downhearted. I get even more determined than ever before to ensure that when he grows up, he can be as proud a Scot and proud a Brit as me, but he can also grow up in a united kingdom rather than a divided Scotland. That's what I want. So yeah, we've got to look at these polls, we take it seriously, but those of us who believe in the Union, who will fight for the Union, have to work harder and better than ever before to promote what Scotland gets from the Union and what Scotland gives to the Union.
And how much responsibility do you think the Westminster government has to play in the support for union here?
I've said in my speech to party members that...
For independence, sorry, I said union.
Yeah,
of course I meant independence.
Yeah. I knew where you were going, Fiona. But I said to party members, you know, we need to do far more. And all of us do. All of us who believe in the union have to work far harder to promote that case of what Scotland gets from the union.
Have you spoken to the Prime Minister about it? Out of interest?
Yes, I have. I've spoken to the Prime Minister, I've spoken to MPs, I've spoken to previous MPs and previous Prime Ministers, or not Prime Ministers, but politicians from respective governments, because I think it is something. Since 1997, when we had a referendum in Scotland that voted for the Scottish Parliament to be re-established, and since devolution in 1999, I think there has been a feeling in London by successive UK governments of devolving and forgetting. And that disinterest only aids the nationalist cause. But for me, there are so many things to be passionate about for the union, what we should be fighting for. And that argument is as strong today as it was 6 years ago when we had a referendum in 2014.
Miriam.
Yeah, I mean, I think the first point to make here is that the campaign for independence hasn't actually started yet. I'd argue Westminster's just making the campaign in and of itself. It's increasing appetite for independence just by virtue of the actions that it's taken. I'm not surprised to see a growing appetite for independence. I think we've had a multitude of factors. I don't think there's any one single factor that has increased the support for independence. I think there's been a multitude of things. You know, I think it's important to bear in mind where we were prior to this. We'd faced a decade of austerity from a government that we didn't vote for. We saw a Brexit vote pushed through from another government we didn't vote for, backed by billionaire financiers, and when Scotland voted Remain, it didn't make an ounce of difference. Now we see the pushing through of the internal market bill, which I think, and you know, to quote Mark Drakeford, the Welsh First Minister, that this is an enormous power grab. And we're seeing a shoring up, a concentration of powers in Westminster from devolved nations, and that matters most now, because what that does is set the standards going forward for goods and services. Now, that's important because we are heading into trade deals. I'd argue it's not going to be the UK government that are going to set those standards. It's probably going to be the US and whoever our future trade deals are with. And frankly, we're going to see a race to the bottom. And I think it is very eminently clear that areas like our NHS will be on the table. We have already seen concerns from farmers. We have already seen concerns from environmental campaigners and unions about what the prospect of that might be.
I mean, the UK government has always been at pains to say the NHS won't be on the table. Just to
the UK government also voted against, if I'm correct in remembering here, the UK government also voted against an amendment to the trade bill to protect the NHS against foreign interference and to protect wages. Did you vote against that?
It's been absolutely categorical that the NHS is not up for sale in these trade deals. But just
no, I'd like to hear from the audience because. You've delighted us long enough, Douglas, on this particular point. Kate McLaren.
Thanks, Fiona. I'm just wondering, having been through the previous independence referendum, and then the chaotic fallout of Brexit, whether you voted Remain or Leave, when people will start to realise that referendums aren't the right way to decide anything.
Susan Lindgren, I'll come to you in a minute. Just let me hear from Susan.
I'd like to know who's requesting all of these opinion polls at the moment. UK is currently facing an economic and a health crisis of epic proportions, and surely constitutional questions are just a complete irrelevance at the moment. Can't we just focus on what really matters right now as one United Kingdom?
Ian?
I think we had a referendum five years ago. It's an incredibly important question. We should absolutely not be addressing it again. What's gone completely wrong in the last 2 or 3 years is that we've got a Scottish government who generally are adversarial and negative about a whole range of things that might happen with UK and Scotland working together. And that's what we should have. We don't have a devolved government which is just looking after Scotland at all. We've got a devolved government who are focused on independence. And what we need is a devolved government who will work with the UK government. And you know, I've got a list of 6 different things here which could happen, but right now are being held back because, frankly, the Scottish government's position is they don't really want to get any big money help from the UK government because somehow it'll cut across their devolution rights. So the structure and the system right now just isn't working. If we could get that sorted out, and honestly get both governments working together in a whole range of quite exciting things that could be done, then we'd be able to look ahead. We're not. With great respect, the SNP party have got one objective in mind, and that's independence. Their actual job is to look after the Scottish people and to get the best deal for the Scottish people. That's not the top priority right now.
Kate?
Well, I'd fundamentally disagree with that, and having just had an answer where I talked about the need for extension of the furlough scheme and welcoming it when it was announced clearly, I do have a very vested interest in ensuring that the UK government delivers for Scotland. But actually on this, I agree with Douglas Ross in his maiden speech to the Conservative Party conference a few weeks ago, where he stated that his Conservative Tory bosses just don't care about Scotland. And that, I think, is the bottom line, and that is precisely why we're seeing an increase in the polls. Now, the polls are just indicative of public opinion, but we had the 9th consecutive poll showing a majority of support for independence.
And do you think that the falling out there's been between Nicola Sturgeon and Alex Salmond has been helpful in that regard?
Well, I think most people are more interested right now in ensuring that businesses get support, that we suppress the virus, and also making decisions about their long-term future, because they can see, certainly the polls prove this point, they can see that Scotland's best interests are served by a Scottish government. Now, the question for me is, what is the democratic route to delivering that? That's a question that I would pose to the Conservatives, because certainly it's unsustainable and it's undemocratic to keep saying no. We've got an consistent increase in the polls. We've got another poll yesterday saying that 2/3 of people in Scotland think that there should be another referendum in the next 5 years.
What about Susan's point that with Brexit looming and what that may bring, and with being in the middle of the pandemic, that this is something that should be put on the back burner for now?
And that's precisely why right now, certainly from a Scottish Government perspective, every minute of my day is spent in dealing with the virus and dealing with the economic fallout of the virus. But clearly there are going to be questions emerging. If you take one question like economic recovery, the last time we saw the UK government borrowing to these levels was probably 2008 in the aftermath of the financial crash. Now, that was followed by a decade of austerity where the poorest in society paid for the failures. And as we come out of this crisis, I want to ensure that we are investing in people, we are investing in infrastructure, and we deal with our public finances in a fundamentally different way. That will require financial powers, fiscal powers, to be in the hands of the Scottish Government, not the Conservatives in Westminster that most people in Scotland don't vote for.
Can I just...
Yeah, sure.
I'm just going to get to the rest of the panel because I'm worried we may not fit them in because we're beginning to run out of time. Seema Malhotra, so the question is, how long can the UK government continue to deny the Scottish people the right to have a say on their future? If Keir Starmer was Prime Minister, would he give them that right?
Well, we have said that we will be going into the next Scottish elections opposed to a referendum and opposed to independence. And I think it comes back to the point that we're in the middle of a pandemic, and it just is very surprising to me that Kate talked about investment and she talked about the polling data, but I'm just surprised she didn't mention, for example, that the child poverty figures that are out today show that child poverty in Scotland is at 24% and rising as well in Nicola Sturgeon's own constituency and in Glasgow. And I think that we're missing the point about what we should be really focused on. People's health, jobs, the economy, education. Children this year who have seen a disrupted education, it's not going to magically correct itself next year. And look, I just feel that the last thing people are going to want is another divisive referendum when there are such important issues to focus on, just to rebuild our health system with our NHS currently still under strain, with a lot more to come, our economy with jobs possibly not back to pre-COVID levels for another 2 or 3 years, with the education, the retraining, with older people losing their jobs and catching up with younger people. I think that these are the really critical issues, and that's why the Scottish Labour Party has been focusing on these issues, and that's what they will want to be talking about, because this is where so much of the polling also shows that people's priorities are across the United Kingdom. And I'll make this final point. People in my constituency, myself, many others across the United Kingdom have got friends and family in Scotland, and we remember how divisive the last referendum was. Then we saw the Brexit referendum with all the division that brought. I think people want a period of healing. They want the whole country to be working together. And that's certainly where Keir Starmer is focused, because if he's Prime Minister, as I hope he will be, he wants to be Prime Minister of the whole of the United Kingdom. And I think that that's how we'll tackle these major issues like child poverty, like aspiration, and like prosperity, to make sure that that reaches all parts of our nation.
Mark, you wanted to come in.
Yes, my father, who will be 100 in 2 weeks' time, was born in Glasgow, my mother in London. My wife's family came from Aberdeen, Edinburgh, Manchester and the south of England. I worked in a health service where people came from all over the country and indeed all over the world. And the great science that's been done in the UK, again, is very international. So I think my answer is obvious.
I think it is. I think we know where you stand. There's a few hands up, and we've got very little time left. I just want to get round a few if I can. Lucas.
So I'm coming from a place where, growing up in England and then coming to a Scottish university, I was originally very pro the union. But then seemingly all my Scottish friends that I've made here at the uni are all pro-independence, and that seems by far the dominant sentiment. And on the point made that it's important that we look for health and healing and ambitions and prosperity, seemingly what most of my friends say is the opportunities for Scotland outside of the United Kingdom, potentially being back in the European Union or making their own way, as the UK and Britain have said that we're going to do outside the Union ourselves, those opportunities are so much greater than if we're stuck here in the United Kingdom and being consistently held back by Westminster that continues to prioritise London over any other part of the UK.
OK, so our hour is up. Tonight, our questions came from Edinburgh, as we can see. And next week, we'll be joined by our audience in Sedgefield, alongside Nobel Prize-winning economist Joseph Stiglitz. So that should be quite a programme. The week after that, our audience comes from Lincoln. So do please get in touch if you're from either of those areas and you want to be on the programme. You can go to the Question Time website and follow the instructions there. Adrian, Charles and guests are on Question Time Extra Time on 5 Live now. That's just about to start. You can see on the screen how to get in touch with them. Thank you very much to the panel for coming tonight. Mark and Seema, thank you very much for doing your part down the line, being part of the debate. And, of course, to our audience, our virtual audience in Edinburgh, thank you to you. And, of course, thank you to you at home for watching. From Question Time, bye-bye.